When people are told to study the teachings of Jesus, they often expect clarity, wisdom, and consistency. But when you actually read the words attributed to him in the Gospels, the picture is not consistent at all. Instead, you find a series of contradictions that make it hard to know what his actual message was supposed to be. On one page, Jesus tells people to love their enemies and turn the other cheek. On another, he speaks of bringing not peace, but a sword, warning that families will be divided because of him. Both statements are presented as truth, but they cannot both represent a consistent philosophy. If you build your moral life on these teachings, you end up with confusion, because the foundation itself is unstable. Take the way Jesus speaks about wealth. In one place, he says it is nearly impossible for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. He tells a wealthy man to give up all his possessions to be perfect. This suggests total rejection of material wealth. Yet in other passages, Jesus spends time in the homes of wealthy people, accepts expensive gifts, and even praises a woman for pouring costly ointment on his feet, saying it was more important than giving that money to the poor. If poverty is holy, why praise the waste of wealth? If generosity is the goal, why scold the disciples who wanted that resource used for the needy? The contradiction exposes a deeper problem. The teachings can be read to support both poverty and luxury, depending on what someone wants to believe. His message on family shows the same instability. At times, Jesus tells followers to honor their parents, a command that fits with traditional morality. But elsewhere, he tells them to hate father, mother, wife, children, and even their own lives if they want to be his disciples. He speaks about abandoning family obligations to follow him, even rebuking a man who wanted to bury his own father before joining. These words turn family loyalty into something almost sinful, even though elsewhere he criticizes those who dishonor parents. If morality is supposed to give guidance, what guidance is this? You can't both honor your parents and hate them in the name of faith. You can't both cherish your family and walk away from them as a sign of devotion. One cancels the other, leaving followers to pick whichever version suits them. Then there is the issue of peace and violence. Jesus is often portrayed as the Prince of Peace, the one who said, "Blessed are the peacemakers." But he also says he came not to bring peace, but division. He tells his disciples to buy swords, even if it means selling their clothes to afford one. Later, when one disciple uses a sword in his defense, he rebukes him and insists those who live by the sword will die by the sword. So which is it? Should his followers arm themselves or not? Should they seek peace or conflict? These mixed signals reveal a deeper truth about religious texts. They can be shaped to justify almost anything. A church that wants peace can point to the soft words. A church that wants power can point to the harsher ones. The same book gives both weapons. The contradictions extend to forgiveness. Jesus famously tells people to forgive endlessly, 70 times, 7 times. He teaches the Lord's Prayer, where forgiveness is central. Yet he also speaks of eternal damnation, of sinners being cast into fire where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth. How does unlimited forgiveness coexist with eternal punishment? If God's mercy has no end, why does his justice last forever? Either punishment ends or forgiveness does, but in the teachings, both are claimed at once. Followers are told to forgive others infinitely, yet the God they worship cannot forgive those who fail to believe in the right way. That inconsistency is not a minor issue. It cuts at the very heart of the religion. Jesus also contradicts himself when talking about how to treat outsiders. He speaks of loving one's neighbor, extending kindness even to enemies. Yet he refuses to help a Canaanite woman at first, comparing her people to dogs and saying his mission is only to the lost sheep of Israel. Only after her persistence does he grant her request, almost grudgingly. The message is not universal love, but favoritism cloaked in occasional exceptions. Later, missionaries used his words to spread their religion to every nation, but that universalism was not consistent in his own actions. If the Son of God shows partiality, what does that say about the teaching that love knows no boundary? Another area of contradiction is truthfulness. Jesus says plainly that people should let their yes mean yes and their no mean no, rejecting oaths. Yet he frequently speaks in parables, giving deliberately unclear answers. When questioned directly, he sometimes refuses to answer, or gives cryptic replies that leave people confused. At one moment, he says nothing is hidden that will not be revealed. At another, he insists he teaches in parables precisely so that outsiders will not understand. A teacher cannot both claim to reveal truth openly and also obscure it intentionally. The contradiction is fundamental, raising the question, was the goal clarity or confusion? His relationship with the Jewish law is another tangled area. Jesus says he came not to abolish the law, but to fulfill it, and that not a single letter of it will pass away until heaven and earth disappear. Yet he also breaks Sabbath rules, dismisses dietary laws, and declares all foods clean. He criticizes Pharisees for their strict observance, but then tells followers that unless their righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees, they will never enter the kingdom. He says to obey those who sit in Moses' seat, but condemns those very leaders as hypocrites. How is someone supposed to reconcile obeying the law with disregarding it? How is anyone supposed to surpass Pharisees in righteousness while also abandoning the laws they guarded? The contradictions show that Jesus' teachings are not a reliable guide to morality, but a patchwork that reflects different voices and agendas. Even his statements about himself clash. At times, he tells people to keep his identity secret, warning them not to tell anyone he is the Messiah. At other times, he openly declares himself the Son of God. In one gospel, he insists no one knows the day or hour of the end except the Father. In another, he seems to speak as though he knows all things. In one place, he prays desperately for God to remove his suffering, showing doubt and fear. In another, he speaks with complete confidence that his mission is necessary and cannot be changed. The contradictions make it difficult to know if he is meant to be fully human, fully divine, or some shifting mix of both depending on the moment. When people highlight these contradictions, defenders often say they can be harmonized if you look deeply enough. But that itself reveals the problem. If truth requires endless explanation, if clarity requires twisting passages to fit together, then it was not truth to begin with. A consistent teacher does not need defenders to explain away contradictions. A consistent teacher speaks with coherence. If this is supposed to be the foundation of morality, why is it full of instability? If the words of Jesus were truly divine, why are they so inconsistent? Another area where Jesus' words collide with themselves is in the way he speaks about judgment. He warns against judging others, saying that with the measure you use, it will be measured back to you. He tells people to remove the log from their own eye before criticizing the speck in another's. Yet he himself constantly judges others, calling them hypocrites, blind guides, whitewashed tombs, children of the devil, and worse. He pronounces entire groups condemned, not only for their actions, but for their unbelief. If judgment is forbidden, why model it so aggressively? If judgment is wrong, why does he reserve it for himself? A principle that applies only one way is not a principle at all. It is a power move. Then there is the teaching on secrecy and public display. Jesus tells his followers not to pray in public, not to make a show of their fasting, and not to perform good works for human praise. He says these things should be done in secret, so that only God sees. Yet he himself prays publicly, performs miracles in front of crowds, and even says that his works are meant to be seen so that others may glorify God. His disciples spread stories of his wonders far and wide. If the point was humility, why does the record emphasize spectacle? If works should be hidden, why is the religion built on public signs and wonders? The contradiction undermines the very teaching it claims to uphold. A similar tension exists in his view of the future. In one passage, Jesus tells his followers not to worry about tomorrow, that each day has enough trouble of its own. Yet throughout his ministry, he speaks of the coming end of the world, of the urgent need to prepare for judgment, of watching for signs of his return. Telling people not to worry while filling them with dread of imminent apocalypse is not consistent advice. One statement encourages peace of mind, the other constant vigilance and anxiety. When you put them side by side, the result is psychological whiplash, not wisdom. The contradictions appear even in the way he treats his own disciples. He calls them friends, assures them of his love, and says he will be with them always. Yet he also rebukes them harshly, calling them faithless, slow to understand, even Satan when they contradict him. He warns that betrayal and denial will come from within their group, and that some of them will fall away. If his closest followers cannot be trusted or relied upon, how can his wider teaching stand as a stable foundation? He both uplifts and undermines them, building confidence and tearing it down in the same breath. That pattern reflects not clarity of vision, but inconsistency of character. The contradictions go deeper when you compare the moral tone of different sayings. Jesus teaches mercy, telling people to turn the other cheek when struck, to give not only their coat but their cloak also. Yet he also speaks of eternal fire prepared for those who do not care for the least of his brothers, as though failure in charity is punishable by endless torment. On the one hand, patience and mercy are lifted up as divine traits. On the other, cruelty beyond human imagination is described as God's response to disobedience. These two moral visions cannot be reconciled. Either mercy is supreme or punishment is. Holding both at once creates a religion that can justify any act in the name of righteousness. Even his teaching about truth and honesty is unstable. He praises childlike sincerity and tells followers to speak plainly, without oaths or embellishment. Yet he himself sometimes withholds truth, refusing to reveal his identity clearly, even swearing people to secrecy after miracles. In one moment, he tells Pilate that he came into the world to testify to the truth. In another, he says little in his own defense, allowing silence to do the talking. A teacher of truth who also conceals it cannot be trusted as consistent. If truth matters, why wrap it in riddles and silence? If deception is wrong, why practice it in the name of divine purpose? There is also a striking tension in the way Jesus frames salvation. In one place, he tells people that those who do the will of God will enter the kingdom of heaven, implying deeds are what matter. In another, he says belief in him is the central requirement, reducing salvation to faith. In the parable of the sheep and goats, salvation is based on acts of kindness to others. In the conversation with the thief on the cross, salvation is granted instantly without works, based only on a moment of faith. Which standard holds true? Deeds, faith, or both? The contradictions here are not harmless. They shape how people think about morality itself. If salvation comes by faith alone, then works are secondary. If it comes by works, then faith is unnecessary. If it comes by both, the teachings still conflict because Jesus himself never settled the standard. The contradictions even extend to how he views children. He says that the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these, praising their innocence and humility. But he also warns that children can be corrupted, saying it is better for someone to have a millstone tied around their neck and be drowned than to cause a child to stumble. If children are naturally close to God, why such fear of their corruption? If they are examples of faith, why the constant warning of their downfall? Once again, the teaching shifts depending on the moment, leaving no coherent principle to follow. Even the central command of love is not consistent. Jesus says to love one's enemies, to pray for those who persecute you. Yet he also speaks of whole cities being cursed for rejecting him, comparing them unfavorably to Sodom and Gomorrah. He says it will be more tolerable for ancient wicked cities than for those who heard his words and did not believe. Love that extends to enemies but not to skeptics is not universal love. It is conditional loyalty. A teaching that claims boundless compassion but draws sharp lines of exclusion is a contradiction dressed in pious words. These contradictions are not small matters of interpretation. They are woven throughout the Gospels. They allow different readers to find whatever message they want. Those who want peace find peace. Those who want war find war. Those who want wealth can point to one verse. Those who want poverty can point to another. Those who want mercy find mercy. Those who want judgment find judgment. The teachings do not point consistently in any one direction. Instead, they scatter, leaving followers to pick and choose which version of Jesus they prefer. When you step back, the contradictions make sense historically. The Gospels were not written by one person recording verbatim teachings. They were written decades after the events by communities with different agendas, preserving fragments of oral traditions and shaping them for their purposes. Some wanted a peaceful teacher, others a fiery prophet, others a mystical figure. The result is a patchwork of voices presented as one. But when read together, the contradictions cannot be hidden. They are evidence of a human process, not divine revelation. Defenders of faith often say the contradictions show complexity, as though being inconsistent is a sign of depth. But complexity is not the same as contradiction. A profound teacher can be complex without contradicting himself. A confused record is not profound, it is incoherent. When you hold two opposing principles at once, you don't have depth, you have instability. And instability cannot be the foundation of truth. The contradictions in Jesus' teachings matter because they shape the lives of billions. They affect how people treat money, family, outsiders, and morality itself. If the teachings were truly consistent, they could provide a stable foundation. But instead, they bend to whatever someone wants them to mean. And when words can mean anything, they end up meaning nothing at all. The contradictions are especially sharp when it comes to the kingdom of God. Jesus says at one point that the kingdom is near, even within the lifetime of his listeners. He tells his disciples that some of them will not taste death before they see the kingdom come in power. Yet centuries have passed, and nothing resembling that promise has happened. To explain this away, later interpreters had to spiritualize the kingdom, saying it was not about earthly events, but about personal faith or the church. But that was not how his words first sounded. They carried urgency, an expectation that the end was near. Saying the kingdom was both imminent and delayed creates a contradiction that has fueled endless confusion and disappointment among believers. Another contradiction appears in the way Jesus speaks about his role in fulfilling prophecy. At times, he presents himself as the fulfillment of the law and the prophets, as though everything written before pointed directly to him. Yet in other passages, he dismisses those who demand signs, refusing to validate himself by prophecy. He claims both that his works confirm Scripture and that his mission is beyond the need for proof. You cannot be both the visible fulfillment of prophecy and above prophecy at the same time. This tension has led to constant debate over whether the Hebrew Scriptures actually predict him, or whether such links were forced later by gospel writers. Either way, the contradictions remain. His teaching about prayer also sends mixed messages. Jesus tells his followers that if they ask anything in his name, it will be given. He says faith the size of a mustard seed can move mountains, and that whatever is asked in belief will be received. Yet he himself prays in Gethsemane for the cup of suffering to pass from him, and that prayer is not granted. If prayer always works with faith, why does his own prayer fail? If prayer is sometimes denied, why promise unlimited success? The contradiction between unlimited promises and selective results leaves people disillusioned, yet it continues to be preached as truth. Consider also how Jesus speaks about the law of retaliation. He tells people not to resist an evil person, to turn the other cheek when struck, to walk 2 miles when forced to walk 1. This sounds like pure pacifism. Yet he himself confronts injustice, overturning tables in the temple, driving out money changers with a whip, and speaking harshly to religious leaders. He does not turn the other cheek when challenged, but instead meets confrontation with confrontation. If the teaching is passive endurance, his actions contradict it. If the teaching is active resistance, his words contradict that. This inconsistency shows that the moral vision is not stable, but fractured. The contradictions even extend to the value of human effort. Jesus says that with God, all things are possible, and that without him, people can do nothing. Yet he also praises acts of faith, charity, and persistence, as though human effort matters greatly. If all depends on God, why reward human striving? If human striving matters, why say people can do nothing? The teaching cannot hold both without breaking into incoherence. For those trying to live by these words, it creates constant tension. Are they to wait passively for God or act boldly themselves? Both answers can be found in the Gospels, depending on which verse you choose. There is another deep contradiction in how Jesus treats doubt. At one point, he blesses those who believe without seeing, making doubt seem like weakness. He criticizes those who demand signs, calling them faithless. Yet he also grants Thomas the chance to see and touch his wounds, giving him the very proof others were denied. He rebukes doubt in general, but answers it when it suits him. If doubt is to be condemned, why reward it? If faith without sight is blessed, why provide sight when people ask? Once again, the message is not consistent, but self-contradictory. Even his view of wealth and poverty wavers in ways that cannot be reconciled. In one moment, Jesus tells his followers to store up treasure in heaven rather than on earth, warning that where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Yet he also promises earthly rewards to those who leave everything behind, saying they will receive back many times more in this life, along with persecutions. The promise of both heavenly reward and earthly gain contradicts the warning against material focus. If treasure on earth is worthless, why promise more of it as a reward? If heaven is the true goal, why guarantee earthly return? The inconsistency shows that the teaching bends to the needs of persuasion, not to the demands of truth. Another striking contradiction appears in how Jesus handles truth and secrecy about his identity. Sometimes he commands silence after miracles, insisting that no one tell others what happened. Other times he performs miracles openly, proclaiming that his works testify about him. If his mission was to spread light, why command secrecy? If his mission was hidden, why allow public spectacle? Both cannot be true. The contradiction points again to different traditions being stitched together, with no concern for consistency. There is also the matter of authority. Jesus teaches humility, telling his followers not to seek titles like rabbi or father, for they have one teacher and one Father in heaven. Yet he allows himself to be called teacher, Lord, and Master, even encouraging the recognition of his unique authority. If titles are to be rejected, why accept them? If humility is the goal, why allow exaltation? This contradiction reveals that the teaching was less about humility itself and more about consolidating authority under one figure, himself. That is not humility, but control. Perhaps the deepest contradiction of all lies in the central theme of love. Jesus says the greatest commandment is to love God with all your heart and your neighbor as yourself. This seems noble and consistent. But then he says that anyone who does not hate father, mother, and even their own life cannot be his disciple. He tells people to love enemies, yet threatens those who reject him with eternal destruction. Love is preached as the highest value, yet hatred and exclusion are demanded in practice. When love is conditional, it ceases to be love in any meaningful sense. The contradiction here is not just intellectual, it strikes at the very core of the moral vision that Christianity claims to be built upon. These contradictions are not minor errors in memory or translation. They form the fabric of the gospel record. They reveal a figure who is at once merciful and merciless, peaceful and violent, humble and authoritarian, forgiving and condemning. They reveal not a coherent teacher, but a collage of different traditions, stitched together to serve religious purposes. For those who want to believe, the contradictions can always be explained away. But for those who read honestly, the contradictions are unavoidable. And this raises the most important question. If these are the words of a divine teacher, why are they so inconsistent? Why do they collapse under scrutiny? Why does the supposed foundation of eternal truth wobble like a house built on sand? A God should not contradict himself. A human, however, often does. The contradictions in Jesus' teachings reveal their human origin. They reflect the voices of multiple storytellers, not the voice of heaven. The contradictions become especially revealing when you look at the way Jesus describes himself in relation to God. In some passages, he says he and the Father are one, suggesting equality. In others, he says the Father is greater than he is, and that he can do nothing by himself. At times, he claims divine authority to forgive sins and to judge the world. At other times, he submits in prayer, showing weakness, ignorance, and dependence. If he is equal to God, why pray to God? If he is subordinate, why claim unity? The two positions cannot both be held without collapsing into contradiction. What emerges is not a clear theology, but competing claims stitched together by later writers trying to make sense of a figure who had become larger than life. The contradictions also appear in how Jesus frames morality. He speaks of fulfilling the law, not abolishing it. Yet when it comes to moral rules, he changes or even rejects them. He dismisses divorce as immoral, even though the law allowed it. He expands the definition of adultery to include mere thoughts, intensifying the law rather than fulfilling it. He commands love of neighbor, but then tells followers to cut off a hand or gouge out an eye if it causes them to sin, introducing self-harm as a moral principle. Is morality about compassion or mutilation? Is it about upholding the law or reinterpreting it? His teaching shifts constantly, making it impossible to form a stable ethic. Then there is his teaching about signs of the end. At one moment, he warns people not to be deceived by false messiahs or rumors of wars, saying the end is not yet. At another, he says wars, earthquakes, and famines are the very signs that the end is near. He says no one knows the day or hour, not even the angels, only the Father. Yet he also speaks as though he knows exactly what will happen, giving specific descriptions of cosmic events. Uncertainty and certainty are presented side by side, creating an unstable vision of the future. For believers, this has fueled centuries of failed predictions, each justified by one set of sayings while ignoring another. The contradictions about peace and violence also return when you look at his instructions to disciples. He tells them to go out without money or weapons, trusting God to provide. Later, he tells them to take purses and even to buy swords. He criticizes Peter for using a sword in the garden, yet tells him to arm himself just before. Peaceful mission or armed mission? Trust in providence or self-defense? Both instructions exist, and both cannot be lived out at once. The teaching swings back and forth, giving no coherent direction. Another contradiction lies in the way Jesus addresses outsiders. He says not to cast pearls before swine, suggesting that some people are unworthy of truth. Yet he also tells his disciples to preach the gospel to all nations, making no distinction. He says his mission is to Israel alone, refusing to heal Gentiles at first, yet later he praises the faith of a Roman centurion as greater than any in Israel. Universal or exclusive? Open or closed? His words provide both answers, leaving the religion to choose depending on context. This is not consistency. It is opportunism preserved in text. Even his teaching on wealth and generosity wavers in uncomfortable ways. He warns against storing up treasure on earth, telling people not to worry about food or clothing. But then he praises those who provide for him and his disciples, accepting resources and hospitality freely. He tells one man to sell everything he owns and give to the poor, but doesn't make the same demand of everyone. Some disciples leave their nets and follow him. Others, like wealthy women mentioned in the Gospels, seem to support him financially without abandoning everything. Poverty as a command for some, wealth as acceptable for others. A teaching that shifts depending on circumstance is not consistent guidance. It is situational convenience. Perhaps the most dangerous contradiction lies in his teaching about punishment. On the one hand, he says not to fear those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul. On the other, he describes hell in graphic detail as a place of fire and torment, to be feared above all. He warns of eternal destruction, yet also promises resurrection and renewal. If death is nothing to fear, why fill people with terror of eternal fire? If God is merciful, why is his punishment endless? The contradiction creates a moral system based on both comfort and fear, leaving followers trapped in uncertainty. Fear of hell has driven centuries of manipulation, showing how contradictions become tools of control. Even the resurrection narratives themselves highlight contradictions. In some accounts, women go to the tomb alone. In others, multiple groups arrive. In one version, they see an angel. In another, 2 men. In another, Jesus himself meets them. The instructions they receive differ. The reactions of the disciples differ. These contradictions are not small details. They affect the core of the faith. If this event was the cornerstone of truth, why can't the accounts agree? The contradictions reveal not eyewitness accuracy, but legendary development shaped by different communities to suit their beliefs. The contradictions in Jesus' teachings matter because they expose the human fingerprints on the texts. They show that these words were not carefully preserved divine truths, but fragments from different voices, stitched together without harmony. If people take them literally, they end up with confusion. If people try to harmonize them, they end up twisting the words beyond recognition. In either case, the contradictions undermine the claim that these teachings come from a perfect source. It is important to see what these contradictions do in practice. They allow religion to adapt endlessly. When a church wants to preach peace, it quotes the peaceful Jesus. When it wants to justify war, it quotes the violent Jesus. When it wants to promote wealth, it points to stories of abundance. When it wants to glorify poverty, it quotes warnings against riches. When it wants to promote exclusivity, it uses his words about Israel alone. When it wants to promote universality, it uses his words about all nations. The contradictions make the figure of Jesus infinitely flexible, not because he was coherent, but because he was not. Flexibility is not a sign of divine wisdom. It is a sign of human inconsistency. The contradictions also create deep psychological effects. Believers are told to love and hate, to fear and trust, to forgive endlessly, but also to expect eternal punishment. They are told the kingdom is near and delayed, that prayer always works and sometimes fails, that judgment is forbidden, but also commanded. Living under these teachings creates confusion, guilt, and constant self-doubt. People can never know if they are doing enough, because the standard changes depending on which passage you read. This is not guidance. It is instability disguised as wisdom. If the teachings of Jesus were truly divine, they would not contradict themselves so profoundly. They would be clear, consistent, and reliable. Instead, they are fragmented, contradictory, and unstable. They reflect human voices, not divine truth. They show how religion survives not by clarity, but by ambiguity. Contradiction keeps people dependent on leaders to interpret, because the text itself does not speak with one voice. That dependency is what has kept the religion alive, even though its foundation is incoherent. When you strip away the reverence and look honestly, the contradictions in Jesus' teachings are impossible to ignore. They are not signs of mystery or depth. They are signs of human invention, of texts shaped by different communities with different needs. And when those teachings are revealed as inconsistent, the authority built on them begins to collapse. For anyone searching for stable moral truth, the contradictions in Jesus' words show that this is not where it will be found.